Luxury hotel manager kicked out a homeless man until the owner arrived. Picture this. A man in worn clothes walks into the most exclusive hotel in Manhattan. The marble floors gleam like mirrors. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbows across walls lined with priceless art. And standing behind the mahogany reception desk is a manager who's about to make the biggest mistake of his career. Within minutes, this same manager would be screaming at security, demanding they throw this vagrant out onto the street. His voice echoed through the pristine lobby as wealthy guests watched in horror. But what happened next, no one could have predicted. Because you see, the man in those worn clothes wasn't who anyone thought he was. And when the real owner of this hotel finally arrived, well, let's just say someone was about to learn a lesson they'd never forget. Meet Marcus Chin. 62 years old, with calloused hands and paint-stained jeans. His work boots had seen better days, and his flannel shirt bore the marks of honest labor. To most people walking past him on Fifth Avenue, Marcus looked like just another construction worker heading home after a long shift. What they didn't know was that Marcus owned half the buildings on that very street. You see, Marcus had built his empire from nothing. 35 years ago, he'd arrived in New York with $200 and a dream. He'd worked construction by day, taught himself business by night, and slowly, methodically, bought properties that others overlooked. Today, his net worth exceeded most small countries' GDP. But Marcus never forgot where he came from. He still worked with his hands. Still preferred his old truck to a limousine. And still believed that a person's worth had nothing to do with their appearance. Then there was Richard Pemberton III, the hotel manager. 38 years old, Ivy League educated, and absolutely convinced that his Harvard MBA made him superior to everyone around him. Richard wore $1,000 suits, spoke with an affected accent that wasn't quite British but tried to be, and had never worked an honest day in his life. His daddy's connections had landed him this prestigious position at the Grand Meridian Hotel, and Richard ruled his domain like a king. To Richard, the world was divided into two categories: people who mattered and people who didn't. And he determined which category you belonged to within 3 seconds of seeing you. It was 7:30 on a rainy Thursday evening when Marcus pushed through the revolving door of the Grand Meridian Hotel. He'd just finished inspecting one of his properties downtown, and his clothes showed it. Concrete dust on his jeans. Rain-soaked flannel clinging to his shoulders. Work boots that squeaked slightly on the polished marble. The lobby fell silent. Marcus walked calmly toward the elevator, but before he could reach it, a sharp voice cut through the air like a blade. "Excuse me." Richard Pemberton strode across the lobby, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble like a countdown timer. His face was twisted in disgust as if he'd just smelled something rotten. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a private establishment." Marcus stopped, turned, and looked at this impeccably dressed man with patience that came from decades of dealing with people like Richard. "I'm here to see someone," Marcus said quietly. Richard's laugh was cruel and sharp. "I'm sure you are. Let me guess, you're here to fix the plumbing? Well, service entrances are around back. This lobby is for guests only." The wealthy patrons scattered throughout the lobby began to stare. Some whispered behind their hands. Others pulled out phones, sensing drama about to unfold. "Actually," Marcus replied, his voice still calm, still respectful, "I'm here as a guest." This time Richard's laugh was louder. More theatrical. He was performing now, showing off for his audience of wealthy onlookers. "A guest? Sir, do you have any idea what it costs to stay here? Our cheapest room is $800 a night. Our penthouse suite? $5,000. This isn't a homeless shelter." The words hit the lobby like a slap. Several guests gasped. A woman near the fireplace shook her head in disgust, not at Marcus but at Richard's cruelty. But Marcus didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. "I'd like to book a room, please." Richard's eyes narrowed as he spotted the wallet. It wasn't designer. Wasn't even leather, just old, weathered fabric that had seen better days. To Richard, this was proof of everything he'd suspected. "Security," Richard called out, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "We have a situation here." Two large men in dark suits appeared as if from nowhere. They flanked Marcus, their hands resting on their radios. "Sir," one of them said gently, "we're going to have to ask you to leave." "On what grounds?" Marcus asked, still maintaining his dignity. Richard stepped closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "On the grounds that you're clearly disturbed if you think you belong in a place like this. Look at yourself. Look at your clothes. Look at where you came from and look at where you are. This is the Grand Meridian Hotel. We cater to senators, billionaires, foreign dignitaries. Not, whatever you are. The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the lobby was fixed on this confrontation. Some guests looked embarrassed. Others looked angry. But all of them were watching. What none of them realized, what Richard couldn't possibly have known, was that Marcus Chen wasn't just any construction worker. He was the construction worker who had built this hotel. He was the silent partner who owned 49% of the Grand Meridian Hotel chain. And most importantly, he was the man who had the power to end Richard's career with a single phone call. But Marcus said none of this. Instead, he simply nodded. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'll leave." As he turned toward the door, Richard called out one final insult, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And don't come back unless you can afford to shop here. Try the Salvation Army, that's more your speed." The cruelty of it hung in the air like smoke. Marcus paused at the door, his hand on the brass handle. For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Not anger. Not hurt. Something else entirely. He pushed through the door and disappeared into the rain. What Richard didn't notice, what he couldn't have seen from his position of smug satisfaction, was the woman sitting in the corner booth near the hotel's restaurant. She was elderly, well-dressed, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. She'd watched the entire scene unfold, and her face had grown darker with each passing moment. Her name was Eleanor Hartwell, and she'd been Richard's assistant for the past 6 months. But more than that, she was the personal secretary to the hotel's primary owner. The one man Richard had never met. The mysterious investor who owned 51% of every Grand Meridian property but preferred to remain anonymous. Eleanor had been here tonight for a very specific reason. Her boss, the real boss, was supposed to arrive this evening. She was here to facilitate that meeting. To introduce Richard to the man who could make or break his career. The man Richard had just thrown out into the rain. Eleanor pulled out her phone with hands that trembled slightly, whether from age or fury it was hard to tell. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for. A number Richard had been begging her to give him for months. The number for the hotel's majority owner. Meanwhile, outside in the rain, Marcus stood under the hotel's canvas awning. Water dripped from his hair, soaking through his flannel shirt. He wasn't angry. Marcus had learned long ago that anger was a luxury he couldn't afford. But he was disappointed. Disappointed that after all these years, after all the progress the world had supposedly made, people like Richard still existed. He pulled out his own phone. Not an iPhone, just a simple flip phone that had served him well for years. He dialed a number from memory. "Eleanor? Yes, it's me. I'm afraid there's been a slight complication." 20 minutes later, a black town car pulled up to the Grand Meridian's front entrance. The doorman, a kind-faced man named Giuseppe who'd worked at the hotel for 15 years, immediately recognized the license plate. His eyes went wide. "Mr. Chin?" Giuseppe called out, rushing to open the car door. "Sir, what are you doing out here in the rain? Why didn't you come inside?" Marcus smiled at the older man. Giuseppe was one of the few hotel employees who knew Marcus's true identity. They'd worked together to quietly improve working conditions for the hotel staff over the years. "I tried, my friend. But it seems your manager has very specific ideas about who belongs in his lobby." Giuseppe's face darkened. "Mr. Pemberton did this to you?" Before Marcus could answer, the hotel's front door swung open. Richard Pemberton strode out, having spotted the expensive car from his position at the front desk. His eyes lit up with greedy excitement. Important people arrived in cars like this. Important people meant important opportunities. "Good evening," Richard called out, his voice dripping with false charm. "Welcome to the Grand Meridian. I'm Richard Pemberton, the general manager. How may I assist you this evening?" He was so focused on the car that he didn't immediately notice who was standing beside it. When his eyes finally landed on Marcus, his smile faltered. "Oh, you again. I thought I made myself clear that." "Mr. Pemberton," Giuseppe interrupted, his voice thick with an Italian accent and something that sounded suspiciously like satisfaction. "I'd like you to meet someone very important." Richard's confusion was evident. He looked back and forth between Giuseppe and Marcus, trying to make sense of what was happening. "This," Giuseppe continued, "is Mr. Marcus Chin, the owner of this hotel." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. His face went white. His mouth opened and closed several times but no sound came out. Behind him, through the lobby's floor-to-ceiling windows, guests and staff had gathered to watch this unexpected drama unfold. That's impossible," Richard stammered. "The owner is..." I mean, Mr. Hartwell is... Mr. Hartwell died 3 years ago, Marcus said gently. His shares passed to me. I've been meaning to introduce myself, but I wanted to observe the hotel's operations first. See how things really ran when the owner wasn't around. Richard's knees nearly buckled. The blood had drained from his face so completely that he looked like he might faint. Around them, a small crowd had gathered. Giuseppe wasn't even trying to hide his smile. You see, Marcus continued, his voice still calm, still respectful. I built this hotel with my own hands 30 years ago. These marble floors? I laid them. Those crystal chandeliers? I hung every single one. This building isn't just my investment, Mr. Pemberton. It's my life's work. The silence stretched like a taut wire. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. What could he possibly say? How could he explain away what he'd done? Of course, Marcus went on, ownership isn't just about having your name on the deed. It's about understanding what your property represents, what your employees need, what your guests expect. It's about respect, Mr. Pemberton. Something I'm afraid you've forgotten. Eleanor Hartwell chose that moment to emerge from the hotel. She walked directly to Marcus, completely ignoring Richard's stunned presence. Mr. Chin, she said warmly, I've prepared the penthouse suite for you. Will you be staying long? That depends, Marcus replied, his eyes never leaving Richard's face. On whether certain changes can be made to the management structure. And that's when Richard realized the full scope of his disaster. This wasn't just about one embarrassing incident. This was about his future, his career, his reputation. Everything he'd worked for was crumbling around him because he'd been too arrogant, too cruel, to see past his own prejudices. Mr. Chin, Richard said, his voice cracking like a teenager's. I can explain. I didn't know. I mean, if I'd realized. Marcus held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. You didn't know who I was, Marcus said. That's true. But tell me, Mr. Pemberton, would it have mattered if I really had been homeless? If I really had been just a construction worker looking for shelter from the rain? Would that have made your behavior acceptable? The question hung in the air like an executioner's blade, because they both knew the answer. Richard's treatment of Marcus hadn't been about hotel policy or security concerns. It had been about pure, ugly prejudice. About judging a person's worth by their clothes instead of their character. Pack your office, Marcus said quietly. Security will escort you out in the morning. The lobby of the Grand Meridian Hotel had never been quieter. News of Richard's firing spread through the staff like wildfire, but instead of chaos, there was an almost palpable sense of relief. The housekeepers whispered to each other in Spanish, sharing stories of Richard's cruel treatment. The bellhops nodded knowingly, they'd all witnessed his arrogance firsthand. Marcus spent the next hour walking through the hotel talking to employees. Not as an owner conducting inspections, but as someone who genuinely cared about their experiences. He spoke to Maria, the night cleaning supervisor, in fluent Spanish. He asked James, the night concierge, about his son's college applications. He remembered Giuseppe's wife's name, asked about her recovery from surgery. This was leadership. This was what ownership really meant. As for Richard? He packed his office in silence, his expensive suits and Harvard diploma stuffed hastily into cardboard boxes. Word had already gotten out. By morning, everyone in the hotel industry would know what had happened. His career at this level was over. But perhaps the most telling moment came as Richard was leaving. Marcus was standing in the lobby, still in his work clothes, still looking like the construction worker he'd always been at heart. Richard could have walked past him. Could have left in silence. Instead he stopped. I'm sorry, Richard said, and for the first time all evening, his voice was genuine. What I did, what I said, it was wrong. Not because you're the owner. Just, wrong. Marcus studied him for a long moment. Then, incredibly, he extended his hand. Learn from this, Mr. Pemberton. You have talent. You have education. But until you learn to see people, really see them, you'll never be the leader you could be. They shook hands. Richard nodded, picked up his boxes, and walked out into the New York night. 3 months later, the Grand Meridian Hotel received the highest customer satisfaction rating in its history. Staff turnover dropped to nearly zero. And Marcus Chin? He still wore his work clothes when he visited. Still preferred his old truck to a limousine. But something had changed in that hotel. The new manager, promoted from within the ranks, had instituted a simple policy. Every guest, regardless of appearance, would be treated with dignity and respect. Because you never know who might walk through your doors. You see, this story isn't really about a homeless man who turned out to be rich. It's not about instant karma or dramatic reversals of fortune. It's about something much simpler and much more profound. It's about the fact that every person who walks into your life deserves to be treated with basic human decency. Not because they might be secretly wealthy. Not because they might have power over you. But because they're human beings, and that's reason enough. Richard Pemberton learned that lesson the hardest way possible. The question is, will the rest of us learn it the easier way? The next time you see someone who doesn't look like they belong in your space, remember Marcus Chen. Remember that clothes don't make the person. That appearances can deceive. That kindness costs nothing but can change everything. Because in a world that's increasingly divided by class, race, and circumstance, maybe the most radical thing we can do is simply treat each other with respect. After all, you never know who might be watching. And more importantly, you never know what kind of person you'll be when nobody's watching at all. The Grand Meridian Hotel still stands on Fifth Avenue, its marble floors still gleaming, its chandeliers still casting rainbows across those priceless walls. But now it stands for something more than luxury. It stands as a reminder that true class isn't about what you wear or where you went to school. It's about how you treat the person who can do nothing for you in return. And that's a lesson worth learning no matter who you are.